Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. If you could take your seats. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. It's always a bit sad to have to disrupt such an animated conversation, but unfortunately we do need to get things rolling this evening. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Melinda Salento. I am the Chief Executive Officer of the Committee for Economic Development of Australia, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. Of course, the first thing I would like to do is to invite Uncle Alan Murray to the stage to do a welcome to country. Uncle Alan, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Alan Murray. For those who don't know me, I'm a Wiradjuri Gamilaroi Yorta Yorta person through my parents. My mum's from Walgett, she's a Gamilaroi woman, and my father is a Yorta Yorta Wiradjuri man from Cummeragunga Mission on the Great Murray River, which is in between Echuca and Shepparton on the Barmah Forest. Lived in Sydney all my life. I've been a board member, chairperson of the Metropolitan Local Land Council. And one of those things about doing a welcome to country, because I'm not a Gadigal person, I have to do acknowledgement to country and then proceed with a welcome to country. Acknowledgement of country is one of those things that you have to take with great pride and joy, and to make sure you don't upset the ancestors, because this country, this Sydney, was a very pristine place to live. And one of those things about the clans that lived here in Sydney, most of them are no longer with us, and because of those early impact of European settlement in those first 5 to 10 years where Sydney was expanding and the Aboriginal people were moved off their own homelands. Most of those clans do not live today, so by default we are the custodians of most of those lands. And with that understanding is that we have to make sure that everything about the culture knowledge is shared and properly shared, so that we can benefit, so that other Australians can benefit as well. On behalf of the Metropolitan Local Land Council, welcome to Gadigal land, Aboriginal land, sovereign land of the Gadigal people. The Gadigal people have been here. If you look underneath this carpet, down to the concrete, down to the foundation, is 40,000 years, 60,000 years in the scientific world, 120,000 years, where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been on this continent for many, many thousands of years. We don't have a pronoun to say how many thousands of years, we say many and more. That's how long we've been here on this continent. And through that, we understand this, how to govern this land, and we have survived on this land from day dot. So on behalf of the Metropolitan Local Land Council and the Aboriginal community of Bretton, welcome to Gadigal land, Aboriginal land. Have a wonderful night. Enjoy the speaker. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Uncle Alan, for that welcome to country and for opening proceedings for us. Can I also acknowledge that we meet on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to the elders past, present and future, and also acknowledge the tremendous role that Gadigal elders play today in supporting reconciliation and in sharing their culture and traditions and knowledge with all of us. My role tonight is really one of taking care of formalities. The Treasurer will arrive shortly, but until then, can I start by welcoming and acknowledging the many CEDA board members that we have in attendance this evening? Diane Smith-Gander, who's appointed as chairman of CEDA today, which is fantastic news. Andrew Stevens, Gordon de Brouwer, Ian Watt, Jeff Borland, Jeff Connolly, Megan Motto, Ming Long, Miriam Silver, Patricia Faulkner, Pradeep Phillip and Stephen Spargo. Now, to anyone who's paid much attention to CEDA, you know that's a pretty long list. And as you'll discover later on this evening, we've got a rotation of some directors leaving and some directors joining us. So that explains a slightly longer list than usual. And of course, a special welcome to outgoing Chairman Paul McClintock. And I've got here, and your wife Elizabeth, but when she arrives, we'll say. I was going to say it's a pleasure having Elizabeth here with us, and hopefully we'll see her shortly. Can I thank our major sponsors, Allen's Lawyers. This is the 10th time that Allen's Lawyers have sponsored this CEDA event, and Siemens. This is the first time that they have sponsored our annual dinner, but many of you will realise that and know that Siemens have been long and very strong supporters of the CEDA program. Having members like Allen's Lawyers and Siemens support these events and provide sponsorship, of course, makes these events possible. They enable us to put really great speakers on the stage and to promote and share very important conversations. So we are very appreciative of their ongoing support and thank them very much for it. Of course, there's also many of you hosting, or CEDA members who are hosting tables tonight, and it's always great to see our members out in force bringing other people to our events and sharing that experience. So thank you as well. I think your logos are on the screen, and we do appreciate your support. Anyone who's attended a CEDA event knows that we love to bring a big audience together, proof tonight, for important conversations, but even more than that, we like to take our discussions to a wider audience. We have and will have media in the room throughout the night. We're always appreciative for the media for following what we do and getting that to a wider audience as well. And we're live streaming the event tonight via the CEDA website. And that's something that's getting a lot more traction and interest for us, so we're very happy to be able to do that and to let people who couldn't be here to enjoy the event and engage in the event. And you will also know that we always like to encourage you to engage through social media. If you're tweeting, please join the conversation using hashtag #OzPoll and tag us at CEDA_news. And if you want to ask a question but don't feel like doing so by fielding the microphone, you can do that too. On the screen behind me are the pigeonhole details that we'll be using this evening. This lets you participate in the Q&A without even having to raise an arm. So if you've got a question, feel free to log on to Pigeonhole and warm up and make sure that the Treasurer earns his keep this evening. I look forward to your questions, and I'm not going to make any promises because I haven't spoken to him about this, but if we don't get to all the questions, I might see if we can get the Treasurer to respond to some of the unanswered questions and get that up on our website as well. Now, just before I introduce CEDA's outgoing Chairman, Paul McClintock, I would like to welcome Elizabeth and thank her for being with us tonight. It's nice that you could be here and share in this evening with us. I'm also going to just let you know what the proceedings are for this evening. Following Paul's introduction, we're going to play a short video with some highlights from CEDA over the past year. Entree will be served, and then Alan's managing partner, Richard Spiro, will take the stage to introduce the Treasurer, who I should say has just been held up, so he will be here shortly. And before we move on, can I just take a moment to thank my team. You know, I said that these events don't happen without sponsors, of course, but they absolutely don't happen without the team at CEDA. They're a fantastic team. I very much appreciate their hard work and their efforts and their support. Most of them are in the room tonight. If you don't know them, introduce yourselves, and as I also like to say, if you've got any ideas, please talk to them. Now to Paul. I wanted to thank you for your support as well, for me and for the team, and for all of your hard work. There are so many other things that you do and that you could be doing. And I want to acknowledge and express my appreciation for the fact that you have continued to invest your time and efforts in advancing good public policy in Australia, as you have done quite literally for decades. I appreciate it, and I hope the nation appreciates it. Your contribution over the last 5 years, and in particular during the last 2 years, which has been my time as CEO of CEDA, I think has been a really important one. You've been a steady hand at the helm while also initiating and driving the work that we've done over a number of years to re-energise and reposition CEDA to have greater impact and greater voice in public policy. And I thank you for that. So thank you, Paul. Can I ask all of you to join me in welcoming Paul to the stage?
I'm very relieved. I was thinking I was going to have to start off by looking for a new wife, but But thank you, Melinda. Thank you, Uncle Alan, too, for that beautiful welcome to country. And welcome to everybody here tonight. I have some formalities. Why I have formalities, I've no idea, because someone made a very blunt remark about people turning into feather dusters earlier today, and a number of the directors looked at each other rather banefully about the fact that it was not a phrase that we wanted to use today, but it is. There's a sense of liberation, I guess, in handing on an organisation like this, but only if you hand it on in fantastic form and you hand it on to somebody who you know has got the ability and the character and the values to take it from here and to take it to greater places, which, of course, in Diane we've found. So broadly, this is a very happy night for me because I feel that we have done good things, but I all know that even better things are yet to come. So let me start by some formalities, and it really is a report on what happened at CEDA's AGM today. And it was a big day for CEDA because a lot of changes took place. So first of all, can I acknowledge the work of the outgoing board members? The first one is Rodney Maddock. Professor Maddock finished up during the year and he ran the research committee. The research committee is the heartland of this organisation. Some people think it's the finance committee or something, but it isn't. It is the research committee. That's where so much of the really high quality thinking about Australia has to take place, and Rod led that with great distinction. Stephen Spargo, who has also been our man in Melbourne and has done a wonderful job and been involved with our organisation over such a long time. Andrew Stevens, who had the joy of actually chairing our audit committee, and that has a very broad role in the place. And Patricia Faulkner, a very good friend of mine who we have shared many stages together, from COAGs to Jesuit Social Services. Patricia's a very distinguished Australian, but also somebody who very much kept CEDA focused on the fact that economic development has to be sustainable and has to be fair and just and take people with you. And that's a role that Patricia plays in all the places that she's been in, and has been one of the many things that she has done in this organisation with great distinction. First of all, thank you to those retiring directors for your commitment to CEDA and for your support for what I've been asked to do, and your counsel, all of which has been very sound. We have new board members, Ming Long, Professor Jeff Borland and Dr Gordon de Brewer. They joined today along with Jeff Connolly, and that's four fantastic new directors who will have a number of roles. Obviously, Jeff and Gordon are both very distinguished and well-known economists, and that continues the tradition that CEDA always has of having some very well established and prominent economists. We have some others actually already on the board, but they certainly have added to that, and Jeff is taking on Rod's job chairing our research committee. Jeff will be our man in Melbourne. We've also got this evening a number of CEDA honorary life trustees. Jeff Allen, where's Jeff? Where's Jeff? Jeff, wave wherever you are. Jeff over there. I am so pleased to see Jeff here tonight because Jeff was the guy who knocked on my door and said, I've got this great idea, why don't you become the national chair of CEDA? I was happily tucked away in the governor's, not being noticed, and but Jeff, of course, was my predecessor who really did the early work of re-establishing CEDA and putting it on such a strong footing. We don't see him too often up here, so it's a fantastic, Jeff, that I think tonight's a particularly apt night for you to be here, and I welcome you very much personally, and I thank you for that invitation. It was a happy meeting and a happy meeting for me. Professor the Honourable Stephen Martin, another good friend of the place, there he is over there. Stephen, of course, was Jeff's collaborator in arms during that period of rebuilding CEDA, and then served with me for a period of time, and I'm particularly pleased that he is also here tonight. And of course, a very old friend of mine, Tim Beasley, who is somewhere. There's Tim over there, who is a former CEDA patron and now, as part of our new system, I guess, as part of our leadership team. And again, been a huge supporter of our organisation for a very long time. We've also got honorary trustees Marcus Blackmore and leadership council members Peter Wills, Richard Warburton and Warren Mundine, all very strong supporters who we see regularly, and we appreciate their support. So thank you, all of you, for being here and for that support. Now, as we foreshadowed earlier in the year, and by Melinda, I too am finishing on the board. I stepped down as chairman a moment ago, and of course, as I said before, I'm really delighted that Diane has put her hand up and is willing to take on this task. So tonight is my last chance, perhaps, to talk about where I think CEDA is today and look back a little bit on that 5-year period, although you'll be glad to know not very much. For nearly 60 years, CEDA has used its position as a nexus between business, government, academia and the community to promote debate on what will drive the economic development of this country. And when I became the chair of CEDA 5 years ago, little did I suspect that we were at the midpoint of an extraordinary decade of instability in our national government, where the long-term policy making of the kind advocated by CEDA became almost impossible. Now, coming out of that period, and I think we are, I believe we need to rebuild the capability in the major political parties, and I'm sorry Josh isn't here to hear that, but we'll have a go at telling him that when he arrives, in the bureaucracies, in the universities and in business, to re-engage in high-quality, long-term policy debate and advocacy to drive a strong economy and society. And we must convince the community that that effort is worthwhile and that the benefits of economic growth are worth fighting for. So now more than ever, Australia needs an independent, trusted voice that can draw diverse groups together to advocate for the policy that will ensure Australia's future prosperity. And the work at CEDA, I think, that we've done over the past few years gives us that position. During the last 3 years, the CEDA board has carefully considered how CEDA can have greater impact and influence and draw support for good policy that delivers better outcomes and improves people's lives. And as part of that work, we engage directly with CEDA members, many of you in this room tonight, and stakeholders to examine what the role of CEDA should be and what we need to do better and how we can have more impact. CEDA has always been a conduit for important policy discussions and promoting policy ideas That's something we've traditionally done very well, and we do it in every capital city at scale in a way that nobody else can do. As a result of our member and stakeholder engagement and discussions, the board agreed that we should be more assertive in tackling policy challenges and advocating for solutions. And we got a very strong endorsement from our members that that's what they wanted. This means that, as well as more sharply focusing our research agenda, we have committed to speaking up more strongly on issues important to Australia's future. And as you would have seen in our research this year on issues such as the federal budget, migration and tackling disadvantage, that's what we're seeking to do. Lifting CEDA's voice and impact is, of course, a long-term goal, and while the foundations have been laid, obviously there is a lot more work to be done. Otherwise, Diane wouldn't have taken on the job. So as CEDA heads into the 60th year, I believe that it's on the cusp of delivering some really important work that will influence and drive good social and economic development for many years to come. And that is the task of all of you in the room that support us and are part of this exercise. So all that remains for me to do is to thank the CEDA board. They are a fantastic board, as I've said, and the CEDA staff. The CEDA staff are just amazing. What they can do with the numbers is really amazing. I've acknowledged that at the AGM early on and at the board early before that we've got a number of the state directors here. They are really the frontline players. They've got small teams. They can put on a function for 1,000 people, or they can, pull together a whole series of events on short notice. They do really, really impressive work. But I also would like to acknowledge the personal role that Melinda has played since she was appointed. I said nice things about her a couple of times already today, but I'll say it in this broader group. She was a great find, and I'm delighted that she chose this to be the place where she can use the formidable talents she's developed. She's got a great way with her about sort of bringing people in. She's been a great leader of our team, and she's been a great spokesman for what we stand for. So I believe that CEDA has a wonderful program ahead in the next 12 months and beyond. I really hope that you are as excited about it, because we need you to continue to support us. Thank you very much, and have a fantastic night.
Strengthening our research capabilities and program has been a priority over the past 2 years, and much of this foundational work is now complete. We released 3 major reports in 2019, starting with sustainable budgets, underwriting Australia's social compact in March. This report identified options that can help deliver long-term, equitable and sustainable federal budgets, while also increasing transparency and therefore community trust. CEDA's second research report, Effects of Temporary Migration, was released in July. The report aimed to better understand the role that temporary migrants play in Australia's economy. The report provided key recommendations on how the federal government could enhance its approach to temporary migration policy, ensuring the stability of the program in the years to come. Released in September, CEDA's inaugural company Pulse was a nationwide survey of the general public and business leaders to better understand community expectations of business and the challenges facing business leaders. CEDA's cross-sectoral membership base, drawn from across business, government, academia and the not-for-profit sector, is invaluable for bringing unique insights to important policy issues that matter for Australia's future. These issues form the core of our policy stack and will continue to be our focus in the coming year. In addition to a re-energised focus on research, in 2019 CEDA delivered more than 300 events across Australia that attracted nearly 600 high-calibre speakers. Highlights included CEDA's annual national flagship events, such as the Economic and Political Overview publication and event series, which was launched in Brisbane in February. The launch was followed by 8 events held around the country with more than 2,000 attendees. Other highlights included CEDA's State of the Nation conference held at Parliament House in Canberra and the annual State of the State events held across Australia. Coverage of CEDA's research and events was strong in 2019, helping to ensure CEDA content reached a wide audience, with coverage across Australia's leading media outlets, including The Australian Financial Review, the ABC and Sky News. 2020 is already shaping up to be an exciting year for CEDA. The economic and political overview will be launched in Sydney in February, followed by a series of events across Australia. A strong research agenda is taking shape that will see a series of reports produced during the year on data, migration, disrupting disadvantage, and the second Community Pulse survey. And in addition to CEDA's annual State of the Nation conference in Canberra in June, a high-level forum on the policy implications of technology and data is being planned. CEDA would like to thank all members, sponsors, contributing authors and speakers for their dedicated support. We look forward to your continued engagement with CEDA in 2020.
Thank you all and good evening. I'm Richard Spiro, the Managing Partner of Allens. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I wanted to take a brief moment to applaud you, Melinda and Paul and your team for the fantastic work that CEDA does to facilitate public debate and conversation. We've been a proud sponsor of this dinner for 10 years, as Melinda noted, and we've been a CEDA member since 1982. I'd also like to particularly acknowledge and congratulate you, Paul, for your incredible work and commitment as CEDA Chairman during your term, and say how much we are looking forward to working with you, Diane, over the years ahead. It's my great pleasure to introduce the Honourable Josh Frydenberg, the Treasurer of the Commonwealth of Australia, as our guest speaker tonight. I'm sure you're all fairly well acquainted with his CV, but to recap, elected to the House of Reps in 2010 as a member of Kooyong and been re-elected 3 times, appointed Treasurer in August 2018, having also served as Assistant Treasurer in 2014-15. Josh has also served as the Minister for Environment and Energy, Minister for Resource Energy in Northern Australia, and as Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister. He has academic qualifications in economics and law, a master's degree from Oxford and Harvard, and has, amongst other jobs, has worked as a jackaroo, a lawyer and an investment banker. So perhaps we could get an insight into which of those roles is most useful in your current role at the moment, Josh. We all know that our economy has been remarkably resilient over a very long period of time. Strong balance sheet, low interest rates, low unemployment, a growing population and a relatively cohesive and collaborative social framework. Nevertheless, as the Treasurer has flagged today, we face some complex economic, climate and cultural balancing acts ahead that require calm and considered decision-making, balancing current needs against those of future generations, balancing a growing population against the pressure that puts on infrastructure, balancing economic and security issues. Managing all that is critical to maintaining our economic and social resilience so that we continue to enjoy peace and prosperity. I'm very much looking forward to hearing the Treasurer's views on how we, well, specifically how he, meets those challenges, and I invite him to speak to us now. Please join me in welcoming the Treasurer to the lectern.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. Can I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to join the chorus of appreciation to Paul McClintock. He is somebody who I had the pleasure to work with in government in a previous capacity. He's always been somebody who's been professional in everything he has done and brought high capacity to the tasks that he has had. So too with Diane. Best of luck. It's a job for life or not. But again, you're someone who is of the highest calibre with a great reputation in corporate Australia, and I wish you all the very best in that role, as well as thanking Melinda, the board members, some new, others leaving, and Richard and Allens for supporting this event tonight. And I want to thank CEDA for the opportunity tonight, acknowledging their history of contributing to public policy discussions that advance Australia's economic and social development. CEDA continues to lead the way in focusing on long-term solutions to some of our nation's most complex issues. Tonight, I will focus on 3 issues: the state of the domestic economy, the headwinds facing the global economy, and the challenge of an ageing population and how we are responding. With the budget back in balance for the first time in 11 years and on track for a surplus, it's important that we focus not just on the what, but on the why. At $19 billion per annum, the interest bill we pay is more than double what we invest in childcare and a little under what we spend every year on schools, government independent Catholic schools and others. Our debt burden represents not just a cost to the budget and therefore every taxpayer, but also an opportunity cost, as it constrains the government's ability to invest in other areas. If we don't remain fiscally disciplined today, the next generation will have to pick up the bill tomorrow. The return to surplus will have been hard-fought. When we came to government, we inherited a budget deficit of $48.5 billion, or 3% of GDP, the second highest in Australia's history, even though 5 years had elapsed since the GFC. Since then, we have steadily improved the bottom line, with real spending growth having halved to 2% per annum, the lowest level of any government in 50 years. While we have benefited from a positive terms of trade, we have been prudent in our budget forecasts. For example, the spot price of our largest export, iron ore, is currently around $70 per tonne, whereas it's in the budget at $55 per tonne. This conservative approach has ensured that our record spending on health, education and disability support is not contingent on high commodity prices. A good illustration of our increased funding for essential services is the NDIS. Our share of funding has increased to $8.5 billion this year and will increase by more than 50% again, as the scheme extends from 300,000 people today who are on it to more than 500,000 when it's fully rolled out. In terms of understanding the drivers of our improved budget outcome, the strength of the labour market, with more than 1.4 million new jobs being created since 2013, has been key. Last financial year, more than 300,000 jobs were created, 100,000 more than Treasury had forecast. Unemployment is at 5.3% compared to 5.7% when we came to government, and employment growth remains at 2% compared to the OECD average at 0.9%, and 0.7% is what we inherited. With more people in work, welfare dependency is now at a 30-year low. The stronger budget position has enabled us to cut taxes for more than 10 million income earners and more than 3 million small and medium-sized businesses, while keeping our tax to GDP ratio well below our self-imposed cap of 23.9%. The $158 billion of tax cuts that we legislated after the last election were the largest in a decade. Together with $144 billion of tax cuts that were announced and legislated in last year's budget, we are creating a stronger, simpler and fairer tax system. We are completely abolishing the 37 cents in the dollar tax bracket, which will now see 94% of taxpayers who earn between $45,000 and $200,000 a year pay a marginal rate of tax of no more than 30 cents in the dollar. Treasury has estimated that the Coalition's tax cuts will boost aggregate household disposable income by around $8 billion a year over the next 4 years. The government has also delivered lower taxes for small and medium-sized businesses, and this includes lowering company taxes 5 years earlier than planned and supporting investment by extending the instant asset write-off to $30,000 and expanding it to businesses with a turnover of under $50 million. The stronger budget position has also given us the fiscal flexibility to respond to significant calls on the public purse, like the drought. The Morrison government has committed over $1 billion additional dollars since the election to provide much-needed support to farmers and local communities. I've seen firsthand the devastating impact that the drought is having. Farmers whose families have been on the land for more than a century have said that they've seen nothing like it. And with 95% of New South Wales and more than 2/3 of Queensland affected by drought, the impact on the Australian economy has been quite significant. If we look at the last 2 financial years, the output of Australia's farm sector is now around 14% lower. Lower farm output is weighing on rural exports as well as food manufacturing. In addition to our drought response, we've also said that we will respond with more funding for aged care in light of the findings of the interim report of the Royal Commission. This will build on what is already record funding for the sector, which has increased by more than 50% since 2013-14. In addition to the immediate spending pressures affecting the budget, such as drought and aged care, the economy is also facing significant global economic headwinds. In recent months, the IMF, World Bank and OECD have all downgraded their global growth forecasts. A principal driver of these revisions has been the flow-on effect of the US-China trade dispute. Now, nearly 2 years on, hundreds of billions of dollars of reciprocal tariffs have been placed on each other's goods. The United States is now threatening further tariffs, which, if applied, will see the amount of trade covered by tariffs reach $735 billion US. While this would represent tariffs covering only around 4% of global trade, the impact has been far more profound. In trade wars, there are no winners, there are only losers. And it's not just the protagonists who are affected, it's the bystanders as well. As a result of the uncertainty and the instability caused by the tariff war, confidence has been hit, investment decisions have been deferred, capital inflows have slowed, and the growth in trade volumes has been severely curtailed. Some countries are feeling the impacts more than others. Germany, the United Kingdom, South Korea and Singapore have all experienced negative quarters of economic growth this year. The other significant dynamic at play in the global economy is the extended period of record low interest rates, which has seen central banks in more than 50 countries cut rates this year. Unconventional monetary policy is already underway in Europe and Japan, and remarkably, 1/4 of all government bonds are trading at negative yields. In effect, investors are paying governments to hold their money as they expect interest rates to stay lower for longer, and they look for the stability and the certainty that sovereign bonds offer. Australia is not immune from these global forces. At 0.75%, our cash rate is at a historic low, and the RBA has also moved. In the words of Governor Lowe, we live in an interconnected world, which means that we cannot completely insulate ourselves from the long-lasting shifts in global interest rates. While we navigate our way through these choppy international waters, Australia, like many other countries around the world, is working through longer-term structural economic challenges, in particular that posed by the ageing of the population. In 1950, 5% of the world's population was aged 65 or over. In 2015, it was 8%. By 2050, it will double to 16%. Some experts are predicting that China's population will start to shrink as early as 2027, with the projection that by 2050 there will be more women in China aged over 84 than the number of people in Australia today. In Australia, We may not be ageing as fast as Europe, Japan or China, but we face this trend nonetheless. Since the first intergovernmental report was released in 2002, we have gone from 13%, or 2.5 million people being aged over 65 and over, to 16%, or 4 million people today. Our median age, now 37, has increased by 2 years since then, and life expectancy has gone to 81 for males and 85 for females. With the 6th highest life expectancy in the world, we are seeing an increase of almost 1 year every 4 years. In Australia today, there are 5,400 people who are over the age of 100. This number will increase more than fivefold to over 26,000 in the next 30 years. As more Australians live longer, the number of working age Australians for every person aged over 65 diminishes. Whereas in 1974-75, the ratio was 7.4 to 1. 40 years later, in 2014-15, it was 4.5 to 1. It's now estimated that over the next 4 decades, it will fall to just 2.7 to 1. As this trend plays out, the impact on the budget will be felt on both the revenue and the spending side. In a report published by the Parliamentary Budget Office earlier this year, it is estimated that the ageing of the population will reduce annual average real growth in revenue by 0.4 percentage points and increase annual average real growth in spending by 0.3 percentage points over the decade. In dollar terms, this equates to an annual cost to the budget of around $36 billion. As the PBO points out, this is more than the projected cost of Medicare in that year. And as our ageing population puts pressure on our health, aged care and pension systems, we need to develop policies that respond effectively to this challenge. It is a great development that people are living longer, but we must be prepared for its implications. Our policies need to leverage the 3 Ps: population, participation and productivity. And when it comes to workforce participation, we are around record highs. And the participation rate for those aged 65 and over has increased from 12.3% to 14.6% over just the last 5 years. The participation rate for this cohort was less than 6% 20 years ago. However, with Australians in work currently undertaking 80% of their training before the age of 21, this will have to change if we want to continue to see more Australians stay engaged in work for longer. It is not about forcing people to stay in the workforce. Let me be clear. It's not about forcing people to stay in the workforce, but rather giving them the opportunity and the choice to pursue lifelong learning and skills training if they so choose. Governments at all levels have a role to play. Federally, we announced a program in last year's budget that was designed to provide career advice and funding support for those aged between 45 and 70 and who were retooling for the workforce. In this year's budget, we announced a National Skills Commission and pilot skills organisations in areas like digital technologies, human services and mining, which is available to support people of all ages. As Ian Yates from the Council of Ageing has rightly pointed out today, employers also have an important role ensuring flexibility in the workplace, which facilitates the continued and valued workforce participation of senior Australians. The Morrison government also recognises the importance of allowing older Australians to earn more from a part-time job without affecting their age pension. It was with this in mind that the pension work bonus was extended to $300 a fortnight in this year's budget. Population factors are also critical in how we meet this ageing challenge. Our migration program has served us well, with the median age of new migrants being 20 to 25, or 10 years younger than that of the broader population. Immigration has helped to soften the economic impacts of the ageing population. The government is ensuring that we understand all the challenges associated with the changing size and structure of the population. Last year, the Prime Minister established a new population portfolio within Treasury with the aim of addressing the challenges while supporting our economic growth. And last month, the government launched a new Centre for Population to work clearly with the states and the territories, academics and think tanks in order to share data, research, ideas and expertise on population. The work of the Centre will provide a crucial evidence base for policies that ensures we have the right services and infrastructure to meet the future needs of our population. The third P, productivity, however, is one area where we need to do better. Like other developed countries, Australia's productivity growth has slowed, but is better than in any of the G7 countries and the OECD average. Australia's 30-year historical average annual rate of labour productivity growth is 1.5%, but our 5-year average annual rate of productivity growth is 0.6%. Productivity is the most important source of income growth over the long run, contributing 3/4 of gross national income growth over the past 30 years. And with productivity tracking at less than half its long-term average, our focus is on deregulation, skills, industrial relations and other microeconomic reforms that improve service delivery. Infrastructure is a key area, with the Prime Minister announcing just yesterday $400 million plus in a package which involves both new money as well as bringing forward spending on 6 projects in South Australia, with announcements in other states to come. Our 10-year, $100 billion infrastructure pipeline will better connect people to jobs, their homes and their communities, and improve access from our farm gates and our factories to domestic and export markets. Finally, when it comes to meeting the challenge of an ageing population, it's vitally important that we get the settings right around retirement incomes. Under our retirement income system, the combination of the age pension, superannuation and voluntary savings work together to secure the living standards of Australians in their retirement. As Australia's superannuation system matures, already with a pool of savings of around $2.8 trillion, future retirees will have higher superannuation balances to support them in retirement. Consequently, the age pension will make up a smaller proportion of future retirement incomes, and a higher proportion of pensioners will be on a part-rate pension rather than the full rate. In the context of this changing dynamic, I recently announced a review of the retirement income system, which will be led by former Treasury official Mike Callaghan and include on the panel Professor Deborah Ralston and leading business figure Caroline Kay. The review will look at the 3 pillars of the existing retirement income system. This is the first comprehensive review of the system since the establishment of compulsory superannuation 27 years ago, and it follows a recommendation of the Productivity Commission. Through its work, the review will establish a fact base of the current retirement income system that will improve the understanding of its operation and the outcomes it's delivering for all Australians. The panel will release a consultation paper in the weeks to come and will provide a final report to the government by mid-next year. Ladies and gentlemen, as we implement our economic plan to repair the budget, to grow the economy and to guarantee funding on essential services, we do face some significant domestic and global economic headwinds. This will require calm and considered decision-making, and we cannot afford to engage in knee-jerk reactions to every economic event or every request for more government funding. Our ability to effectively manage these short-term challenges, as well as in the longer term, the challenge of an ageing population, will depend on this approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Treasurer. Plenty of food for thought there. We'll break shortly now for main, and then we're going to come back for some Q&A. So, as Melinda mentioned earlier, questions can be sent through by text or old-fashioned. Just put up your hand. Anyway, thank you. Q&A part of the evening, so if I could ask you all to take your seats, and we'll ask the Treasurer up to join me on stage. Thank you, Treasurer. Just to remind you, if you'd like to ask a question, do you want to grab that one over there? Yep. Please raise your hand. A microphone will be brought to you. Mention your name and organisation, and perhaps ask a brief question so we can leave time for others. And then we'll get going. I might start with a few questions, then I'll ask for the audience. Questions from the audience. Thank you, Treasurer. And thank you for your very insightful comments to begin with. There's plenty in there for us all to think about. I wonder if I might just start about talking about China. And you have talked a bit about that recently, but that balance that we have in the middle of the US and China, the importance of China as a trading partner, but dealing with those issues. And how do we deal with those issues, recognising that they're such an important trading and investment partner for Australia?
Well, I think it starts with a recognition that Australia has been a great beneficiary of China's rise. If you think what has happened to their economy, basically since Deng took the reins in 1978, it's been remarkable. As I said the other day, in the 2 decades before 1978, China's economy increased by 2.5 times. In the 2 decades after, it was 21 times, and then it just increased to be the largest economy in the world today on a purchasing power parity terms, and the second largest to the US on US exchange rate terms. Now, for Australia, they are our largest trading partner. About a third of our exports go to China, and it was worth over $200 billion two-way trade last year. So we have a trade surplus with China. The United States have a trade deficit. And so they look at that relationship, that economic relationship, with a different lens. Now, the Americans have raised very legitimate issues about forced technology transfer, intellectual property, industrial size subsidies and the like. So what we say is, look, we don't have a dog in that fight. But what we do care about is having a rules-based, open, transparent trading system. So our message to the Americans, to the Chinese, privately, publicly, is absolutely the same. We want to see these tensions resolved, and we want to see an adherence to a rules-based trading system, and that involves, for example, reform of the WTO. Now, there will be differences between Australia and China over human rights, over foreign policy. You'll sometimes see investment decisions that they may not be happy with. But at the end of the day, relationships need to be stronger than individual differences. And the Chinese benefit greatly from the relationship they have with Australia, from what we export to them. I mean, they wouldn't have been able to go through this rapid industrialisation and this urbanisation without the commodity and the agriculture and increasingly services exports that we're sending over there. So it's a mutually beneficial relationship. We have to recognise we have different political systems to China, and we have to recognise we've got an alliance with the US, of course. But I think we can manage that relationship. And just finally, what I'll say, Richard, is the best, and things have changed since then, of course, but the best illustration of Australia's ability to navigate our way through this relationship was on consecutive days in October 2003, when you had George W. Bush address the Australian Parliament, and then Hu Jintao, the Chinese president, address the Australian Parliament. You had the two presidents address the Australian Parliament in consecutive days. Now, there is no better example of how we can manage that relationship than that example.
Staying offshore, you've talked about the importance of the Bretton Woods agreements. You also mentioned in your speech tonight about the global headwinds that we're all facing. In the face of those global headwinds, and be the Brexit or what's happening in the US or Hong Kong, what's Australia's role in rebuilding trust in global institutions and reinvigorating that sense of collective obligations which you've talked about?
Yeah, well, I talked about the Bretton Woods Agreement in a speech I made at the ANU last week. And why I did that was because that was a really good example. Back in 1944, 44 countries, of which Australia was one, came together in the context of the Second World War coming to an end, and basically agreed to put any differences aside about aggressive currency devaluations or tariffs or protectionism and unilateralism. They put that aside and they came together and they said, we're going to establish the IMF, we're going to establish what became the WTO, and we're going to establish the World Bank. And those three institutions have been remarkable examples of multilateralism as a stabilising force. So I'm not Pollyanna-ish. I'm not glossing over these real challenges that the US and China have and other countries in the world have. But if you want an example of multilateralism and cooperation, then I think Bretton Woods, which is 75 years ago this year, is a good example of that.
And so how do you think we can go about resetting that debate around trade and the importance of those sorts of arrangements? What role does Australia play in doing that?
I think Australia has an important role because we are obviously a trusted friend of the United States and we're a valued partner of China. And so we have an ability to speak to them and to others globally. And, we're a wonderful, successful trading nation. 1 in 5 Australian jobs are related to trade. 1 in 10 Australian jobs are related to businesses that have benefited from foreign investment. So, this is a great story of 25 million people who have opened up our economy to the world and benefited from it. And not only have we struck bilateral trade agreements with Indonesia most recently, but Japan, Korea, China, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and most recently RCEP, which are both multilateral agreements. So we're trusted on that stage. So one of the things that the Prime Minister, Simon Birmingham, Maurice Payne, myself and others are pushing is how can we make the WTO more of a relevant organisation? And that's with reforms, particularly around issues like dispute settlement.
You're not Pollyanna-ish, but are you optimistic about what can be done?
I'm more optimistic than not about the US and China avoiding another round of tariffs. Now, I might walk out the door and find out that doesn't turn out to be true. I don't know. But what I do know is in my discussions with my US Treasury counterpart, the US Treasury Secretary, a guy called Steve Mnuchin, and at meetings where senior Chinese officials were at just a couple of weeks ago in Washington, I got the sense that both sides want to come to the table. Whether they can and whether they do, time will tell.
Returning to things domestically and touching on some of the things that you mentioned in your speech, in terms of productivity, you've commented recently that this is not about throwing buckets of money to make our economy more, or businesses more efficient or more productive. So what's the pathway, do you think, towards better and greater productivity?
Well, one area that I'm focusing on with the state and territory treasurers, and I put on the agenda at the last what are called KIFA meetings, was this productivity agenda through deregulation and implementing the recommendations of the PC's report called Shifting the Dial. They had, I think it was 28 recommendations. 22 of them were either the sole or joint responsibilities of states. Now, this included things around heavy vehicle reform, health service delivery, education, other areas where we can work together. It even touched on areas that were just the states, so like zoning and planning laws. There's obviously some work being done by the states around stamp duty and land tax. That's not the federal government's prerogative, or remit, payroll tax, other areas like that, where no doubt you can shift the dial, to use the PC's words, without big buckets of money. In the past, the Hilmer reforms, they saw incentive payments from the Commonwealth, but where budgets are tight, and I think there's plenty of scope for good work in those other areas.
On the population question that you talked about this evening and in the paper today, is there a bit of a magic pudding going on? If we're talking about older people continuing to work, we want to encourage younger people into the workforce. Is there room for both, or is there a net sum gain there?
No, I definitely think there's room for both, and as you know, it can be a virtuous cycle. Like, if you have more people in work, then they're earning more, and if you're earning more, you're spending more, and more demand will generate more supply and therefore more jobs. So, it's Adam Smith's invisible hand, and that is a good outcome for the economy. The other thing is, I think, if you talk about seniors, they have incredible skills but also experience, which can be deployed very effectively by employers in the market. So there's certainly jobs to go around. Then, industries are changing. The big byword for the economy at the moment is disruption. I saw that as Energy Minister, people generating power on their own roofs, peer-to-peer trading. I see that now as the Treasurer, fintech, banks closing branches, but people going online. It's very interesting in the retail sector, how much of it is structural, how much of it is cyclical. People, again, going online to purchase as opposed to the corner store. Transport, autonomous vehicles. If you speak to people in the mining sector, incredible what's going on in the Pilbara right now. Autonomous trucks, autonomous trains, autonomous drilling equipment. Companies like Siemens are, the cutting edge of all this. There's a lot of disruption. As a country, I don't think we have to fear that disruption. I think we have to embrace it. And that's going to be one of the challenges.
And the government, and the levers the government can pull to deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, my sort of political philosophy is government's not there to provide every solution, right? And governments can help set the rules of the game, and but you don't want to crowd out the private sector. You want to encourage the private sector. So what can governments do? We can provide skills, trainings, and incentives there. We can certainly do some of the big infrastructure, either in partnership with the private sector or certainly in partnership with the states, which boosts the productive capacity. We can provide attractive tax settings, which incentivise work. They're the things that we can do, but ultimately it's the private sector which employ 9 out of 10 Australians. That is where we need to capitalise.
You mentioned some of the other countries that have more severe ageing populations than we do, but in your travels, in your research, are there lessons we can learn from those countries about what things they're doing which are successful or perhaps not successful in dealing with this issue?
Well, there was a former treasurer who said one for the country, one for the mum, one for dad. I never took his advice. We've got two. But I think migration is an interesting one because you need to take the public with you, and obviously, we have sought to do that in a number of areas, some more controversial than others. But we are really now focusing on attracting people from around the world with the right skills that we need. So, for example, we've got a global talent a program now where we're going around the world using our embassies and trying to get people with the right skills and the right age demographics to come and be citizens in Australia. And we're aggressively selling ourselves. I think if you look at some of the other countries, including those in the region, they haven't embraced immigration, and I think it's been one of the great success stories. Now, there are challenges as well with growing population because our immigration has tended to see people, two-thirds of the total number of people, go to either Melbourne, Sydney or southeast Queensland. And I know as a Melburnian, this is creating real pressures. Melbourne's growing by 2,000 people a week. And if you want to get on a train and come down the Frankston line, it's tough to get a seat. And if you want medical and educational services, it might be harder than it was. And you're going to spend more time in traffic than you were a decade ago. So this is the reality of what's happening in some of our bigger cities. So one of the challenges that we're doing, and I'm working with my colleagues on this, and obviously Scott as the Prime Minister, having been an Immigration Minister, understands all this, but we need to provide the incentives to get people to settle right around our country, but not just for settling's sake, but also to work and to be employed and to be long-term contributors.
You and I are both beneficiaries of Australia's immigration policy. How do we think we how do we bring the public along with that debate?
Well, we're not in a minority, that's the great thing about this country. Other than our first Australians, we've, all come from somewhere. And I think it's given us a diversity, a confidence, a capacity that would have otherwise not been there. So I think Australians' starting position is they support immigration. But they also don't want to see a disorderly system. They want to see an orderly system. And that was really one of the challenges, that we faced when we first came to government.
I might just turn to the audience and see if there are any questions that anybody has. If you do, raise your hand. I've got a couple on the screen that I can ask that have come in. Okay, I'll go to the screen. There's a question here on climate change, your views on the risks and threats from that, and what can be done by Australia to mitigate those risks.
Well, it's an important topic, and it's obviously one that's firmly in the public's consciousness, and I know it as being Environment Minister, and I know it from having an electorate, a torpedo punt, that's a Victorian term, from the CBD. So for me, the issue has not been about challenging the science. In fact, it's not for our party. We accept the science. So then the question becomes, once you accept the science, what do you do to mitigate your emissions profile, and how do you do it in the most cost-effective way? And that's where Australia needs to be mature about how we go about it. There's an inevitable transition in the energy sector. So we're rapidly integrating more renewables. But where we have failed over time is to provide the backup and the storage. Coal-fired power stations have closed. That's a reality. But in Victoria, where Hazelwood closed, and it was an old power station, it was 25% of the supply. So suddenly Victoria is now going into the summer really worried about blackouts, and at times a peak demand is becoming an importer, not an exporter of energy. And the people who pay the highest price financially for higher energy costs are those with the lowest incomes, because it's a disproportionate share of their disposable income that goes into energy. So there's a real equity issue here as well, and I think that's where we need to focus. How do we smooth the transition? The other thing I'd point out is the energy sector is 1/3 of the emissions. There's emissions in a whole range of other areas. Some are much more difficult to reduce. For example, agriculture. We talk about capitalising on, the more mouths to feed in the region, for example. That's going to require sheep and cattle, and they belch and produce emissions and everything else. We're proud of our LNG sector, but that's a huge generator of emissions. This debate really needs to focus on the smoothest and most cost-effective transition. It can't happen overnight. We're part of a global agreement, but we need to take the extremity, the extremeness and the coarseness out of this debate. That's what I find most disappointing about the debate on climate change. There's a coarseness to it. And if we all accept that we need to respond to it, then hopefully we can do it in the most cost-effective way.
Back to the screen. Is comment here about the budget and the budget surplus, with the budget outcome moving into budget surplus, does that provide a opportunity to increase spending in health?
Well, spending in health is increasing, very substantially, not just for hospitals, but also, for example, the PBS. I mean, one of the things that happened before we got to government is fiscal circumstances didn't permit the listing of every drug. Now we have listed the drugs, and we've put more than 2,000 drugs onto the PBS at a cost of more than $10 billion, and those drugs, some of which are hugely expensive, are life-changing. So we will continue to see more spending on health, but I don't see, Richard, this notion of budget repair or fiscal responsibility as mutually exclusive from this concept of guaranteeing your essential services. In fact, one enables the other. If you are able to get the budget back under control, as we've done, then you give yourself the flexibility to spend on things that matter most to people, as well as respond to such events as the drought, or, as I mentioned in the speech, the Aged Care Royal Commission, and other things that come up from time to time.
Speaking of Royal Commissions, again back to the screen, there's a... what's your sense of, out of the Financial Services Royal Commission, do you think the banks have turned the corner? Do you think they're rebuilding trust? Do you still think, or are they still on the journey?
Well, there's a lot of people in banks around the table. And as you said, I used to work for one, an investment bank. Look, the Royal Commission... The Royal Commission was obviously an important process that produced a lot of important recommendations which we're implementing. There were 76 recommendations and we're taking action on all of them in a whole range of areas. And we've set out a very deliberate time frame with that. Incredibly, it's an ambitious time frame as well because there's an enormous amount of legislation. What I don't want to happen is I don't want the regulators to overcompensate for the criticisms that they faced, because ASIC and APRA got a bit of criticism. I don't want to see them go from one side of the pendulum to the other, and I don't want the banks to become too risk averse about their lending so much it slows the flow of credit. So it's this balancing act which is so important. You've had a lot of debates, for example, about responsible lending. I mean, those laws have been in since 2009, but we're now in a different operating environment where you've got a bank, it's not a CEO in a bank, it's somebody who's in charge of credit or assessing loans who are looking at it and saying, okay, there's 10 there, I like 7 of them, I normally would go for 2 more, but is it really worth my while to make these loans and to run the risk that I'll be hauled somewhere? And so I don't want that level of fear. I want a level of consideration in these banks to be focused first and foremost on the customer. I think we all want that, and it was very disappointing to see some of the behaviour that was revealed by the Royal Commission. But I think great care needs to be taken now to ensure that the flow of credit is maintained.
I think we have one from the floor.
Yep.
Hello? Yeah, I'm back. Treasurer, I think it's sort of apparent that the Australian economy seems to be ticking along at a fairly pedestrian pace, and one of the things that you mentioned was about some initiatives you're doing around infrastructure. Mm-hmm. At the same time, we know our super funds have got something like around $3 trillion, and currently they're finding it hard to find local investment opportunities. They're looking offshore, and traditionally these groups look at more what they call the brownfield opportunities, where government can actually assist them in investing locally to create jobs and more growth. Can you maybe share your thoughts on that and anything maybe in the pipeline?
Look, it's an important question. In terms of super funds, as you know, as you refer to, they're gone for brownfield sites because they chase yield, as opposed to greenfield sites where there may be more risk involved. Now, that is a conversation I think we need as a nation, particularly as we see an exponential rise in that pool of super funds. So I think that is an important discussion. We saw some of the super funds recently from Australia invest in infrastructure assets in the United States, in the energy sector. So they're prepared to invest there. We'd like to see continued investment here. In relation to the premise of your question, which was about the Australian economy, you're absolutely right that we've been going through a softer patch. But I could point you to mining investment, which has had a tick up after a long period of the production phase where mining investment had declined. I could point you to the housing market where, after seeing clearance rates that were at 50%, they're now well above 70%, prices are stabilised. And why that is important is because it's normally people's number one asset is their home, and if they're seeing the value of their home go up, it gives them more confidence to spend, and consumption is 60% of GDP, and a lot of small business people leverage off their home to expand their business. So that's not unimportant. And the exports have really been very strong, not just on a terms of trade basis, but on a volumes basis as well. So there are things, and then of course we've kept our AAA credit rating, the labour market has been relatively resilient. Our net debt to GDP is a quarter of what it is in the US and the UK, and about a seventh of what it is in Japan. So on a lot of these yardsticks, we're actually, as Peter Costello said this, we're actually a good economy. But hopefully the confidence will be there with business, and they'll continue to invest, and we can grow more strongly in the new year.
Thank you. I think we're stretching the friendship, but I want to take one more from the floor.
Okay.
Thank you. Ross Jackson, Maddox Lawyers in Melbourne, and a constituent of yours, Treasurer.
I'll wait for your question before I pass judgment. So.
More than most, perhaps, you are aware of the disappointment that comes from failing to see a thoughtful, evidence-based policy in the form of the National Energy Guarantee see the light of day. My question is whether it's retirement incomes or any other major public policy area, how do we get past the short-termism, the political shoutiness that we see on a day-to-day basis to achieve a level of long-term evidence-based policy implementation, whether it's in the Henry report or anything else? We've seen so many reports that seem to not see the light of day. What do you see as the future for improving the level of public policy in the country?
Look, again, that's a really important question. You know, one area, and I referred to it in my speech, was the NDIS. I mean, that was it is a remarkable social reform that has received bipartisan support. So I think that is a very good example. The trade agreements, you sometimes see the arguments made against free trade, but I think we've triumphed with those agreements. When it comes to tax, we didn't do it with necessarily the support of our major political opponents, but we did get it through the Parliament. Pretty dramatic reforms to abolish a whole tax bracket and the like. Company tax debate, well, that's a story for a longer day, and we tried there and we weren't successful. On the issue of energy, I think it's very complex. I obviously went through it. I've now got amnesia, so I can't remember those three letters you mentioned. What were they? AFL, that's right. But I do point this out with the National Energy Guarantee. There were two components of it. There was an emissions guarantee and there was a reliability guarantee. The reliability guarantee is now moved forward between the federal and the state. That's important because basically what that is trying to solve for is as more intermittent energy comes into the system, namely wind and solar, that you have more backup and support, whether that's batteries, pumped hydro, gas, other forms of energy that can ensure continuation of supply. So I think you put your finger on a big issue. How do we reach across the political divide and get some of these longer term reforms done? Our record's not perfect, but there's certainly some good stories to tell. And Australia's relative performance, I didn't mention this in the speech, but we are in our 29th consecutive year of economic growth. That's not a slogan, that's a fact. And what that means is that we haven't had 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth, despite a GFC, despite an Asian financial crisis, despite a dot-com boom and bust. That is a remarkable achievement for the country, which both sides of politics can claim credit for. I mean, some of the reforms in privatisation that Paul Keating did and Bob Hawke did with tariffs and in the workplace, some of those reforms helped set us up, just like Howard's reforms on the GST and the waterfront and the trade agreements that Tony and Malcolm and now Scott are engaging in, as well as other things. So there have been lots of hands on this till, and I think despite the headwinds we face today, there is still a very, very good story for Australia to tell.
Thank you, Treasurer. That might be a good note to finish on. I might ask Jeff Connolly, the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Siemens Australia Pacific, to propose the vote of thanks.
I'm actually supposed to have a gift to hand over to the Treasurer, but we'll do that later. You've got it there, but apparently gifts are not allowed. We'll do that later. Richard, thanks very much for your moderation. And thank you, Treasurer, for an important and well-considered speech on what matters most to Australia. Maybe as some introductory remarks in preparing for this evening's comments to you, I, like most people, run to Google and keyed in Australia 1872, which is around about the time that Siemens got to Australia, about the time that Essendon Football Club started as well, Josh, sorry to say. And not surprisingly, surprise, surprise, up came Siemens completes first project in Australia, the Overland Telegraph between Darwin and Adelaide. So we've been here for quite some time. We've been part of what's been going on in the country. And we're proud to deliver technology which becomes, I think, the growing conversation about how we make this place more productive. So we're in digital industries, smart infrastructure, energy and healthcare. And it was pleasing to hear you talk of infrastructure and the need for us to get that organised. As somebody who rarely catches the train to Frankston, but nonetheless lives at the end of the Frankston line, I'd also be grateful if we can sort that out, Treasurer. When Siemens began in 1872, not surprisingly, Australia was fairly regionalised. 37% of Australia's small population lived in cities. Today we live in one of the most urbanised countries in the world, with almost 90% of Australians in cities. Living in cities and 40% living in just 2 cities, Sydney and Melbourne. And as I mentioned a moment ago, that just means that we have to use technologies much more wisely to get ourselves better organised. In looking at other things that are perennials for Australia, education and skills. Victoria, in the research, in 1872, the Education Act was passed. It was a global innovation. Victoria was the first of the Australian colonies to set up central public school system based on the principles of free, secular and compulsory education in a uniquely centralised model of education, unlike those from Britain, the United States and Canada. Today, education remains just as critical as we prepare for the transition, a topic close to my heart, the fourth industrial revolution, as we move into the digitalised world affecting consumer and industry. Transition, the World Economic Forum says by 2022 there will be displaced 75 million jobs, but there will actually be 58 million new jobs net created. That means we need to get running on the sorts of skills that are going to be necessary to run this country into the future. Employer associations in Australia have come back with that piece of information and said, well, actually our members are saying that we can't get the right skills. So education institutions are saying all our graduates are fully employed, and industry is saying we've got the wrong skills. So there is at least a call to arms, I think, for both industry and post-secondary educators to work much more closely together to provide the sorts of skills that this nation will need going into the future. And as a segue, I was really proud, Treasurer, to have had you at our Berlin Advanced Vocational Training Centre in Berlin. It's interesting when you say to the Germans, we're considering doing higher vocational education in Australia. They say, how can you do it any other way? Where we've limited ourselves to seeing that at a TAFE level. There are other countries in the world that actually see that as just an integrated part of the education system. A few words firstly about CEDA. Clearly I've been invited to join the board, and I'm very, very grateful and honoured to have been asked to join this board. CEDA fills a unique place in Australia. There is no other organisation in Australia that actually provides a platform for debate without having a partisan starting point. And Treasurer, we spoke a few moments ago that next year CEDA will celebrate its 60th year, and the State of a Nation event that we run in Canberra will be the biggest we've ever held, and we'd love to see you join us at that event in Canberra. Now, specifically to some of the key points I think that we can tease out of your comments, and thank you very much for the openness of your Q&A. Ageing demographic megatrend in Australia, but I guess, Treasurer, nobody can blame you for having caused that. It's just a challenge that the world has got, and it's something that we all need to manage together, and it's calling out for a multi-partisan approach, not a political approach, to a challenge which we can all see coming at us. Trade wars causing impacts for bystanders, I think, is resonated across the room. Unconventional monetary policy, I agree. There's only so far we can keep cutting interest rates. We do indeed live in an interconnected world, and a lot of the work we've been doing on the fourth industrial revolution is actually saying, yes, it's a double-edged sword, though. There's tremendous opportunities for the reach we can get from Australia outbound if we get connected. But there's a tremendous risk that the inbound traffic is going to overwhelm us unless we get ourselves globally competitive. Population, participation and productivity. I was looking for the fourth P to give you a marketing mix there. And Diane immediately mentioned when you said the participation linked to some immigration rebalancing in terms of younger immigration. Of course, we'd love to see mothers getting back into the workforce much earlier, which may actually contribute to that challenge. Immigration, certainly, as I just mentioned, is a lever. CEDA supports a well-considered regulation and indeed deregulation. You might be interested, there was a small part of the board meeting today that talked about regulation by Royal Commission, and the need for us to be a little careful about policy on the run, regulation on the run, but rather doing things in a more balanced way. Talking of balanced China, of course, Australia's role there is with China. It's crucial for our economic stability, but also the geopolitical one if we play our role properly. Chinese always talk about win-win. In a rules-based market, of course, that means they win once and we win once, not that they win twice. So we look forward to the further dialogue on the topic. Going back to CEDA, to close, it's amazing that CEDA can pull a crowd so quickly. We decided with Alan Finkel that there was a need to get on our feet and talk about the hydrogen developments and to put some positivity into the whole energy transition debate. CEDA, within 2 weeks, set up three roadshows, one in Melbourne, one in South Australia, one in Western Australia, and over 700 people attended. And such is the pulling power of an organisation like CEDA. Treasurer, I congratulate you for your informative and insightful speech tonight, particularly, as I've mentioned, shaping our infrastructure needs, dealing with our generational challenges, and the call to arms to be more productive in this nation. Finally, thanks to co-sponsors, Alan's Linklaters, for their contribution and the many sponsors that have contributed to CEDA events throughout the year. Now may I call on Diane to join me on the stage to give the final closing. Thank you.
Jeff, thank you. I'm really delighted someone who sees things as clearly as you do is joining the CEDA board and will be leading the State Advisory Council in Victoria. It's my pleasure to be up here to close proceedings tonight. So my first official duty is to take this opportunity to acknowledge my predecessor, Paul McClintock, but sadly that first official duty has been gazumped because I have been given a piece of paper here. And it says, in fact, my first official duty is to please tell the Treasurer we will get your CEDA new stripy socks to you as soon as possible. So we apologise you haven't got your gift. And I'm actually informed that these stripy socks are mismatched, perfect for a politician who often gets dressed in the dark. So no worries about matched socks. But Paul, look, we really do want to thank you, and I wonder if you might just come up so that your CEDA board colleagues, your CEDA members and staff can say a special thank you. And I think we've got some lovely photos of your time at CEDA.
Thank you very much.
These are rather lovely. Thank you. I will be coming by to make sure that they are there. Yeah, I'll let you take those because otherwise I think they could probably end up on the floor as they almost did. But your stewardship of the board has been absolutely outstanding, and I think the courage and leadership that has been displayed has really been the hallmark of your entire career. You wanted to set the foundations for CEDA to have more impact, to have cut through in coming years. And I think what you wanted us to do, and I think you said this at one point, was have a bit more bite. And that's clearly in the interest of all Australians. It's a wonderful legacy. And I think I absolutely agree with you that CEDA does need to continue to have bite. So I hope I can make the aspiration a reality, and I know you'll be watching, and I know you'll let me know if you think CEDA is falling short. There have been many highlights of your tenure. I think the National Press Club address around the federal budget repair is clearly one, and setting the foundation for CEDA's next chapter with the appointment of a new CEO and a new strategy is another. So I hope you will put those gifts up on the wall and remember your time at CEDA. I'm personally a great advocate for the course that Paul has helped set for CEDA. Look, I wouldn't become chairman if that wasn't the case. Paul spoke earlier of the need to convince the community that the benefits of economic growth are actually worth fighting for. This will be a priority for me in my tenure as chair. Hand in hand with this goes an imperative for CEDA to have that greater reach, greater cut through of the issues that we identify that matter for Australia's future. In recent years, here in Australia and elsewhere, important policy issues are too often cast in the context of what one group or one sector stands to lose, and I think we heard that in the question earlier. Too little focus on the aspirations for our nation as a whole, too little focus on the long-term policy commitments needed to get us there. So a divisive us or them mentality is going to do nothing but stymie progress. And we can't afford lack of progress on key issues. We risk weakening the economy and the social fabric of what is a vibrant and dynamic economy. I agree with the Treasurer. Our track record absolutely speaks for itself. We have a healthy society. We risk it if we don't sort these things out. Business needs access to necessary skills. Jeff's been very clear on that. The long-term challenges in healthcare and other human services, the environment for long-term investment and the entrenched disadvantage of some Australians. We know from CEDA's Community Pulse report that too many Australians feel disconnected from economic growth, and we know from our Company Pulse survey that the community expects business to focus on its performance across financial and social dimensions and to engage on policy issues relevant to both. We have to show how the benefits of reform will filter through to all Australians, and this means reconnecting the benefits of reform and the benefits of a strong business sector with the community. Otherwise, there's an uphill battle to deliver the change necessary to keep the economy strong. It's a big task, and I believe CEDA can play a significant role in bringing business, government, the community and academia together, just like tonight in this room. It is something CEDA does well. We'll continue to do this through our marquee events. The economic and political overview events are much anticipated. These briefings on the economy and politics in 2020 will be held across Australia in February, and the State of the Nation will return to Parliament House Canberra on June 15 and 16 next year. So I look forward to seeing you there, because CEDA members are at our core. You are the ones that give us the strength to pursue our policy objectives. Members like international law firm Allens Linklaters and global giant Siemens, whose sponsorship of tonight's event is very much appreciated. Thank you, gentlemen. Now more than ever, collaboration with members and input from members will be vital in developing new and innovative policy solutions. So during my term, I look forward to seeing greater collaboration with CEDA members to deliver greater impact. Thank you for coming along tonight. It's been great to see so many of you here. Let's see if we can get onto that mission of reconnecting the broader Australian community to the idea of economic and social development that is so important to our nature's future. Thank you.